Hi, welcome to the DHS Green Earth YouTube channel. Before we get started, we just wanted to say a big thank you for clicking on this video. DHS Green Earth is an environmental advocacy club run by high school students, and so we really do appreciate your support in joining us to help the environment. So today we're going to be talking about our research on snowstorms in Texas. We hope you enjoy and learn something out of it. I'm sure we've all seen it in the news, but from February 13th to 16th, Texas and its nearby states had experienced the coldest storms since 1989. We see a dipping of temperatures all the way to negative 19 degrees Fahrenheit. And as a result, 2 million Texan households lost power and running water, some areas for several days, and at least 58 people have died where storms were most frequent. I've listed a few examples to why so many people are suffering in the central states.
So how did this extreme cold get to Texas? The answer lies in jet streams and a wobbly polar vortex. But what does this mean? To really unpack this problem, we first need to understand what they are. A polar vortex is like a dam. It keeps Arctic air in high latitudes where it belongs. Now, it does move down a bit to bring cold air to the US during the winter, but that's common. What's uncommon is a wobbly polar vortex, which comes as a result of weak jet streams, a band of strong winds about 10 kilometers above the ground that keep warm air out of the Arctic. As you can see in the picture in the top right, the unstable polar vortex allowed the cold air from the Arctic to move farther south, all the way to Texas, and the unstable jet streams pushed the warm air up to the pole, causing the cold temperatures to linger in Texas. And this isn't the first time that's happened in Texas in particular. It's happened in 1989 and again in 2011, freezing Texas's natural gas plants.
In addition to the weather problems, one of the reasons why Texas specifically was so negatively impacted by these weather events was that Texas has its own electricity grid, while the other states in the US are part of either the eastern or western grids, which are made up of 20-something states. And this makes it so that Texas, when it has these climate emergencies, they can't rely on the federal government to support them in that region. And historically, Texas was able to afford being on its own because it makes a lot of its energy by itself in its own state, so it really doesn't have to rely on a lot of other states to help supply its energy. But as you can see here, during these natural disasters and these climate crises, it's really difficult for them to recover from each of these disasters, and it costs millions of dollars to do so. And across the nation, this is happening, but as we are specifically pointing out Texas today, it's important to note that Texas does have its own energy grid, and therefore its problems are a little bit different from the other states. And some of the immediate effects of the Texas snowstorms are that there are a lot of blackouts happening all over the state. This is probably the one that's most widely covered in the news. It's caused by residents using more power, and because Texas relies on natural gas, all of its wells are frozen over, and therefore they couldn't supply the power that the residents needed. And another thing is that the generators that are used to convert fuel to power overloaded and they went offline. And some of the effects that it has on health is that, as mentioned before, Texans didn't have a lot of running water for a couple of days and even weeks. COVID vaccines were delayed. People had carbon monoxide poisoning because they started running their generators inside your homes, which is really dangerous for you. And also the medical devices that were connected to their outlets didn't get the power that they needed. And another interesting effect that isn't as covered in the news is that the process of shutting down and starting up gas facilities and power plants uses more or emits more chemical emissions than normal operation. And this process is called flaring. And so whenever these blackouts occur, you're really releasing more emissions than you do during any normal operation week.
So what does this mean for disaster preparedness moving forward? We should take the Texas snowstorms as a warning for future climate disasters, as we all know that climate change makes weather conditions more extreme and unpredictable. Some disasters that we've already seen made worse by climate change, just to name a few, was the one in summer 2020, when a heat wave in California drove up electricity demand, causing gas plants in California to go offline. Also, we've seen the summer before that in Northern California with the PG&E electricity cutoff. And they did that because they were afraid that dead foliage from the massive droughts occurring would collide with electricity lines and cause forest fires. Other things we've seen in the US and all across the world include increased intensity of hurricanes, increased intensity and frequency of forest fires. Like in California now, forest fires are a year-round threat instead of a seasonal occurrence, and also with the Australian forest fires. And also we've seen an increase in deadliness of floods. One quote that stood out to me a lot while I was researching this was that in 2020, the US experienced 22 weather and climate events that each cost more than $1 billion, eclipsing the previous record of 16 in 1 year. So this is a graph that we had on another slide earlier, and it shows the number of billion-dollar weather disasters since 1980, and we can see it very clearly going up. Also, this sort of ties into how expensive climate change is. A lot of people, when they hear about like climate efforts and climate change activists, they think that they're just ignoring the economy and the economical side of it, but actually climate change is very expensive, and there is an economic drive to try to curb it. Things that we should be doing to prevent disasters like these, or at least alleviate the suffering within them, is to invest in infrastructure resistant to worsening climate disasters. As Isha mentioned earlier, I think that snowstorm like this in Texas already occurred in 1989, and I think the government of Texas did actually put out some regulations for companies of power plants and such to weatherize, but those regulations were voluntary. So obviously those companies didn't pour money into weatherizing their power plants, which wouldn't gain them any profit. Investing in those activities and actually weatherizing our buildings would serve to protect us from the worsening climate disasters that will inevitably happen, or semi-inevitably, predictably. We should also be paying attention to poor communities that are oftentimes hit the hardest and recover the slowest during these disasters. This ties into the theme of environmental justice. Also, we should be continuing to fight the emissions that contribute to a more extreme climate. This can be a variety of things like voting for cleaner energy, enforcing stricter environmental regulations, installing more efficient installations in homes and businesses and buildings to decrease energy use, reducing food waste in landfills to reduce methane emissions that also contribute heavily to climate change, and a whole list of other things. There's so much we can be doing to protect ourselves and to protect our community members. I hope you guys learned something from this, and we wish to see you at our next meeting. Thank you.